Good evening, everybody. Want you to know this is Thursday evening, and the thing that I want you to know most of all, those of you that may not be right here in Bushnell, I look out the side window here and it's snowing. I guess we'll get used to that, though. I'm grateful that you have tuned in to the program this evening. I want to especially thank the gentlemen that are doing the videotaping and the audio with this. They're really special men. One is Corey Nichols and the other is Bob Miller, and they're very, very faithful in this. I want you to know that now we've been doing this now for several weeks, and if I look like I need a haircut, I do. I need a haircut. But I hope this doesn't go on so long that I'll be braiding my hair. This evening, the message or the devotion that I want to give, lead us in, is the title that I've given this message is simply this: Why Your Life Counts for God. Now, I've in a sense intertwined this with the messages that we have had surrounding Easter, the resurrection, and all of this. And I want us to be able to go back in the scriptures, and I think you'll find how interesting this is, that the message is based on a passage from the book of Hebrews chapter 11. But we find the identical message in the book of Exodus. And then we find one that's almost identical in the book of Acts when we come to this matter of our lives counting for Jesus Christ. The passage that I want to read, beginning with, is first of all in the book of Exodus, and it simply says this: And Moses said unto God, Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? I know this is one of the favorite stories of really all of us, because when we think of what has taken place in the scriptures surrounding this specific verse, is that Moses has found himself in the wilderness. One of the things that so many times I believe that we mistake about is thinking that Moses is just a simple shepherd, an individual that is a backward boy. But if we look at the book of Exodus and we look at the book of Hebrews, the one thing that we find is that he was extremely well educated. He had been in the Pharaoh's house. He had lived there for 40 years. He knew the courts. He knew the language. He knew the history. And he loved yet the people of Israel. And here's what this passage says, beginning with verse 23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. Persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Now if we're to look a little bit wider at this, Moses has killed one who is of Egyptian descent, who had been, I guess we'll say, picking on a man from Israel. And when he discovers that he had been seen in doing this, a couple of things happened. He became afraid. And then secondly, he was being threatened by the Pharaoh. And so he disappears for a while. And we find Pharaoh, in a sense, looking after him, trying to find him, trying to bring him back. And all of a sudden, we find something else happening now. Pharaoh, following him around, but Moses, a shepherd. And as he's leading the sheep on this particular day, and you know this story, on this particular day, he looked and there was a bush that was burning, but it was not being consumed. God delivers a message to Moses. And so much of it is involved here in this passage that we find in the book of Hebrews, the faith that is there. God challenges him and says, saying, you're the best man that I'm going to use to take the people of Israel out of Egypt. And Moses simply stands there, and that's the question that he answers. And he simply says, who am I, God? And we look at this and how important it is within our lives. And in reading this account of the call of Moses to leadership, I think we're stopped really short by the questions that he gives to God when he says, who am I? But then it really involves two things. One, who am I that I should go into Pharaoh and ask for these people to be released? Now he was qualified, but still the threat that was there. And then secondly, that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt. And if we were to read the book of Exodus, the one thing that we find to be, in a sense, outstanding is that the people of Israel were not willing to follow Moses at this time. And so he backs off. This would, in a sense, keep him from even wanting to lead the people of Israel because they'd ignored him. You know, why would we want to follow this man? Or why would anyone want to follow me? And when we look at this, the statement that is made about him is that, who made you a ruler? Who made you a judge that you think that you are qualified to lead us out of Egypt? And the second part of this question, as we look at it, Moses probably felt that he had been forgotten by his own people. And so this would be one of the reasons for the response. The fact that they had rejected him, even though he had helped them. And now he finds himself in exile. Now, whatever the reason that Moses had for this, for these feelings and the subsequent questions that he had, we do know this. It's a very human trait, isn't it? To ask the question, who am I? We find this all of the time in the church. Even those who are well educated, when the challenge is given for them to use their gift or their talent, it's what, you know, who am I? I'm not qualified to do that. The mistake that I think that we have made in so many areas as far as the church is concerned is that we have in some way and for some reason we have elevated the individual who is the minister. We'll call him the clergy if we go into the broader sense. And what we've seen in history as far as the church and clergy is concerned is that the only one that has the answer is that clergyman. And we find this is not true at all. In fact, the challenge is given here to Moses, and I believe that the challenge is given to us as the church in general to fulfill the responsibilities and use the gifts and the talents that they have to fulfill what God is asking them to do. But it's easy. I think it's really an easy thing to understand why any person would feel that their life doesn't count for very much with God. After all, this is God. He is the Creator. He knows everything. He will use us. But the feeling that, well, I'm not qualified to do that. I'm not the person. And when we look at that in our own age, we find that it is such an important thing, because what's happening within our own society now is making the individual feel they are unimportant. And we've even gotten to the point where we think that an individual can be replaced by a robot. The littleness that happens to be there, that all of a sudden we aren't important, that we can be replaced very, very easily. When we look at this, we find the littleness being magnified by even what we think about in space. Maybe some of you watched recently some of the documentaries that we had on space and say, this is so great. You know, who am I? I'm so small and so insignificant. But we see that this is I want you to listen to a writing by a fellow by the name of Edward Everett Hale, and he simply says this: I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. And I want us to look at history, the history of the Bible. As we look at this, we find other things involved. It's almost an instance where when change comes along, when revival begins to come to a church, or when, I think now, within our society, and with what's happening to us with the viruses, it's almost the expectation now a revival is going to come. But we think it's going to come through a minister, or we think it's going to come through some magic. But all of a sudden we find it's not going to come from kings or anything of this sort, or presidents, but it's going to come through men and women such as we are now. That's where it is going to come for. Those that have hope. Those that, in a sense, we would say, this is kind of where Moses found it. Moses thought himself to be a disposable person. And how many people think of themselves saying, I'm not important? Almost to saying, I'm disposable. But you see, here is where it is going to come from. And this is what we find the strength of the message that is given to us here. We're not going to depend on artificial intelligence or robots. He's saying we are going to do it one person, one soul at a time. And it's well, I think, occasionally to ask ourselves, who am I? In fact, just ask yourself that right now. Who am I? It's well for us to try, I think, to determine just how valuable we are to God and His work. And if you get nothing else from this evening, you, as an individual, whoever you are valuable in presenting the message of Jesus Christ. If you find not only the message that was given to Moses, but the message was given later on in the gospel narratives, and the statement that is made so clearly is this: I am with you. I am with you. I will be with you. I will be in front of you. I'll head this whole thing off. I will be with you. How valuable this is as we look at it. Our personal influence, as we look at it, accounts for God. And in the 22nd chapter, or 27th chapter of the book of 2 Chronicles, there's one of those very, very terse statements which God sometimes uses as a way of bringing a message to each man of life. And here's what he says: he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. Now he's talking about a particular king at this time, according to all that his father Uzziah did. Howbeit, he entered not in the temple of the Lord. And then it concludes this way: and the people did yet corruptly. It's interesting that here we find Jotham was king. We find the closeness with him and his father. And it's saying he was good. He did well. He did everything according to what his father Uzziah did. But he missed one thing. He did not go into the temple. He did not give this influence. And sometimes we as men think that we are not important. But I think each one of us can look back on an individual, a man, or someone else who very, very quietly influenced us within our lives, just by being who they were. And you see what happened here is that we find all of a sudden that this whole country was influenced. He was a good man. And how many times have we heard that in a funeral message? He was a good man. But then if we look back, what influence did he have? What influence did he have on his own children? And he's saying here that because he did not enter the temple, I believe because he did not worship, and we could put it in a contemporary way and say because he did not attend church, because he was not faithful, then those around him followed the example that he had given. and how significant that is. Jotham did not enter the Lord's house. And I guess we kind of put it this way. His indifference influenced the lives of his subject. They did yet corrupt. The influence that we have is so important. And from the positive side of influence, it's just as powerful as we think of it. Someone writes a verse which states, and this, give me, maybe you've heard this many times before, but I love this. Give us some men who are stout-hearted men. I love the beginning of that. Who will stand for the right that they adore. Start me with 10 who are stout-hearted men, and I'll soon give you 10,000 more. Is not this the story of the Christian faith? Isn't this the example that we found in the very beginning of the church? And listen, I believe that this is the message some way that we must present. The men and women that are strong in their faith. And they will then bring this about to where the church, Christianity, will become strong and remain strong. I think this is the story that we have to tell. 12 men, if you think back in the beginning of the church, 12 men, for the most part, were unlettered men. They were not well-educated men at all. So any of you think, well, you have to have all of the education and everything like that to be of an influence in the church, forget it. He's saying that these were unlettered men, men with a vision and a purpose. They looked out upon a world that was lost, and the morals were bad. There was darkness there. And these apostles, remembering the command that their master had given them, literally went into all of the world preaching the gospel. And their influence, I want you to think about this for a moment. Their influence has marched to 2020. It didn't die. And we can continue to make it grow within our lives and within our world. And when we see this, their influence has really marched, I guess we would say, like a mighty army. And when we think of all of the times within the scriptures that we find armies that are marching thousands and thousands and thousands of men, and what was taking place there, the same thing we can envision as far as the church is concerned. For most of them, there was awaiting a martyr's death. But still, this didn't deter them. This didn't stop them. And I think that we are coming upon a time when Christians and Christianity is being ridiculed. Don't let that stop us. We can't let that stop us. Because then the influence that we have is going to march on. It's kind of the idea, someone is watching you. Do you ever get that feeling? Somebody's watching you. Your personal influence is more than you realize. I remember when I first started in the ministry, and I think I've mentioned this before, or at least the place before, little town of Elizabethtown, Indiana. I was only 19 years old, I believe, at the time. But I always wore a suit coat. And in the middle of August, one particular evening, we had the evening service, and this little boy stepped out of this car with his mom and dad, and he had on a Mackinaw, you know, the heavy winter coat with the fur collar on it. And he was sweating. Sweat was just dropping from his face. And I looked at him and said, "Bobby, what are you doing?" And his mother just looked at me and shook her head. And he walked on in and said, "He told me the minister was wearing a coat, and if the minister wore a coat, that's what he needed to do." How are we going to influence our young people? Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody has to wear coats or anything like that at all. But I am suggesting that the way that we treat one another, the way that we answer one another, the way that we respond to one another, the way that we configure ourselves within our churches and our homes and our society, this is being observed. And we are going to have an influence on the individuals. Someone is watching you. Your personal influence is really, as I have said, more than you realize. And God needs all of us to have that influence. It's not a matter of just saying, oh, well, yeah, that's important. But listen, it is important that that influence be carried on. And our personal witness counts for God. In the first chapter of Acts is recorded, I think, one of the most solemn accounts that we have in history, that of the leave-taking of Jesus from the faithful few that were there. They had followed him through the crucifixion. They had met with him at the time of the resurrection following that, and now they're assembled with him for the last time upon earth. And here is his parting instruction. You shall be witnesses unto me. This is the challenge. This is the gift that he has given. You and I are to be witnesses unto him. Now, there must have been a lot of things when you think about, and I know that we've just worshiped, we've just observed the resurrection, but I want you to think for a moment of all of the things that were taking place, all of the times that Jesus had met with these men and women. When we hear 500 meeting and we find them touching his hand and all of the things that were taking place in that particular area at that time. Certainly there must have been other things that you think were more important than this. Think of all of these things, and he comes with this statement that as laymen, we'll use that term very loosely, but those laymen that are there for the purpose of taking care of the church. It is not something that is simply that of ministers or teachers that have been selected, but the challenge for each one of us. It's the sermon that has been preached here. And the various kinds, I'm not an athletic person particularly, but once in a while I like to watch some yoga. It's always kind of an amusing thing to watch somebody that's going through all the yoga movements and everything. But there's one particular called karma yoga. And even though this religion, by the way, is false, it does contain a teaching that I think has some eternal truth. And it's this. The teaching is that every act of man, every ritual, every task performed is a sacrifice unto God and should be so offered. Think of that. Every act. You know, how wonderful and how influential and how important it would be to our world if the Christian were to take this as the model of it. True religion could be as selfless as their devotion is to this and what it means. And then next, our personal service counts for God. He has no hands but our hands. We've heard this so many times. To do his work. Our personal service means this much to him. Now, we can think of all of the different little events, ways that we have influenced, and I'm sure each one of you can think of these. But I remember one particular event, and this was in the state of Michigan, in Saginaw, Michigan. And it happened to be a small church where I was attending as a child. And there was one man, his name was Reverend Boileau. And Reverend Boileau, one of the reasons I remember this so well is I love automobiles, but he had a 1947 Nash. It was purple and gray. And I loved that car. But Reverend Boileau would come every Sunday morning and pick up children in our neighborhood. Picked up me, my sisters, and then he would go back, he would go to the church, and then he would come back and he would get more. And over a period of time, because of him using his automobile in this way, 7 of the individuals that he picked up became ministers. Can you imagine that? 7 of them. The influence that he had, which everybody said, what's Boileau doing that for? Why is he doing it? These are just kids. They don't have any money. They can't do anything. How important it is that our influence and what we do and what we say is to those around us. Edwin Markham has written a poem which, again, maybe some of you have heard. And I think it's one of the greatest messages that we have. In it, here's Conrad, who was a very humble cobbler. And he dreamed that Jesus would visit for him the next day. And so the next morning, he got up very, very quickly, and he started straightening up his child and anxious, or his office or his area there. And he was so concerned about this because he was getting ready for what? The master to come. Conrad shared the things with him. He said, Nick, first of all, we find that an old lady who was hungry came, and she was begging for a piece of bread. And so he gave her his. And then there was a beggar that came. It was very cold. And he put his arms around him and gave him a pair of shoes. And finally, he heard the cry of a small child. And he took this child and he simply returned him to his mother. And the poem concludes this way. The day went down in the crimson west, and with it the hope of the blessed guest. And Conrad sighed as the world turned gray. Why is it, Lord, that your feet delay? Did you forget that this was the day? Then soft in the silence of a voice he heard, lift up your heart, for I kept my word. 3 times my shadow was on your floor. I was the beggar with the bruised feet. I was the woman that you gave bread to eat. I was the child on the homeless street. Did not the master of all life say, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me. We find that passage in the book of Matthew. And now I'm going to write a line for this very thing. And it is simply this. If you did not do this to the least of these, what would we say? You did not do it for Christ. And how urgent this is, that we do everything that we can and realize as we look at this and simply answering the question and really observing what God has asked us to do. Give ourselves to Him. As we conclude our celebration of Easter, and as we look to a new beginning, the day when we can celebrate as churches and families again, let's keep this in mind. The influence that we have even now as times have closed down. Maybe this is the greatest time that we have ever had, the opportunity to do this. I'm going to ask that we close this lesson this evening with a word of prayer. Would you bow your heads with me, please? Dear Father, I thank you for the example that you have given us through Moses. The question that says, who am I? Because so often we ask the same question. Who am I? But Lord, you have asked us to serve you. You have given us the opportunities, and you have given us the gift, the ability to do those very things that you have asked. I pray that you will care for those that are in special need tonight. I pray for the men and women that may be hungry, that some way they may come to our attention that we can help. The needs will be met. Help us to be an influence to those around us. That when we do it for the least of these, we have done it to you. We pray this in the name of Christ our Lord, that we serve you well. Amen.